This is I'm Suck, and in this video we are looking at the causes of the Cuban Missile Crisis. So first of all, we need to look at the historical background of pre-1959 Cuba. And seeing as the Caribbean was so close to the US, they were determined to maintain stability in the area. And this was helped by the fact that the Cuban Constitution gave the US the right of intervention, as well as land for naval bases. So this meant that the US held much influence in Cuba. But in December 1956, the Cuban nationalist Fidel Castro returned to Cuba with the support of his brother Raul Castro, Che Guevara, and 79 supporters. And they conducted a guerrilla campaign towards the Cuban president Fulgencia Batista, who was an anti-communist and received economic support from USA. Now, this guerrilla campaign began to gain supporters, and on the 1st of January 1959, Batista's regime collapsed and Castro rode into Havana victoriously. Now, immediately after the revolution, America did little to intervene with the revolution in Cuba. Now, as long as there was no external aid in the revolution, America seemed happy to allow it to go ahead naturally, considering that Castro's government was more nationalist than socialist, and the Soviet Union seemed disinterested. In 1958, Vice President Richard Nixon had conducted a goodwill visit to many of the Latin American states, and this led to a shift in US policies towards the region where economic stability was seen as a fundamental. The US also supported the creation of the Inter-American Development Bank and regional common markets, and Eisenhower had agreed to not supply arms to dictators like Batista. However, facing the inevitable reduction in aid from the US, Castro had to consolidate his own power. And firstly, he introduced a program of agrarian reform where American property was seized by the state. Now, in 1960, Mikoyan, who was the Soviet first deputy premier, visited Cuba and arranged $100 million in economic aid. Now, this tied Cuba to the Soviet Union, both economically and politically, and this ultimately worried the US. Now, this relationship between Cuba and the Soviet Union did have many mutual benefits. As for Moscow, Castro's Cuba was a welcome new revolutionary ally whose geographical proximity to the US, it was only 100 miles away, made them very interesting. Now, for Castro, the Soviet Union were an essential source of economic aid. Now, the first shipment of crude oil came in April 1960, yet US-owned oil companies refused to refine it, so therefore Castro nationalized it. This meant that America placed economic sanctions on Cuba and reduced their sugar imports of Cuba by 95%. Now, instead, the Soviet Union started to buy Cuba's sugar, and the sugar industry accounted for 80% of Cuban exports. Now, the relationships between Cuba and the US then worsened when Castro seized $1 billion worth of US assets. So this meant by 1961, the US decided that it was time to remove Castro and his regime from Cuba. So this leads us to the Bay of Pigs invasion. As in March 1960, Eisenhower had ordered the CIA to train and equip a force of Cuban exiles for an attack on Cuba. And when JFK came into power, he inherited this program. And the plan was to send 1,500 anti-Castro exiles to launch a military coup in order to remove Castro from power. Now, Kennedy supported these attacks despite the fact that he received advice from some military advisors that it would not work. Now, with any luck, the exile force would encourage the citizens in Cuba in a revolt against Castro in order to overthrow him. However, the invasion was a disaster, as the exiles were met by a fierce counterattack from Castro's military. There was no uprising by the citizens of Cuba, and 100 people died with over 1,000 captured. Now, the attack only solidified Castro's power in Cuba, as it revealed the true intentions of the so-called Yankee imperialists, which were the US. Now, although Kennedy attempted to redeem himself by publicly accepting blame for the incident, it left the young president looking vulnerable and inexperienced. But after the Bay of Pigs invasion, Kennedy set up the SGA committee, which was chaired by Robert Kennedy. Now, they had the job of overthrowing the Castro government. And on November the 4th, 1961, they called for an operation based on covert operations to destabilize the regime in Cuba and facilitate an anti-Castro revolution. Now, covert operations are ways of undermining a government through economic sabotage and propaganda. And on the 30th of November 1961, Kennedy gave authorization to Operation Mongoose, in which he chose General Edward Lansdale to control the operation. Now, the operation was unable to achieve anything significant, and instead the US developed an airstrike plan called Plan 312 and a land-based invasion plan called Plan 314. Now, on March 1962, US military maneuvers in the Caribbean started, and this was known as Operation Quick Kick. By this time, the Soviet Defense Minister, Malinovsky, concluded that Cuba would not be able to stand a week in the face of a large US attack, and this meant that Khrushchev concluded that he would place Soviet nuclear missiles on Cuba. And this placing of Soviet nuclear missiles on Cuba was called Operation Anadyr. And the Soviets were willing to support Castro politically, economically, and militarily. Now, therefore, the Soviets provided 14,000 ground troops, bombers, and fighter planes, along with the nuclear missiles which could reach up to 2,800 kilometers from their launch site. Now, the decision to place nuclear missiles on Cuba can either be seen as a defensive measure to counteract the potential aggression from US towards Cuba, or an aggressive alternative to conventional troops, which would not have posed a significant threat to the US. Now, other reasons for the deployment of nuclear missiles was the geostrategic importance of Cuba towards the Soviet Union, and the fact that it would help reduce the missile gap, which Khrushchev recognized was a process that could take 10 years, especially as the US had placed missiles in both Turkey and the UK. Now, Operation Anadyr consisted of 200 trips by 85 ships over 3 months, and these were often conducted in hellish conditions, and several members died on the journey. So thank you for watching this video. Next video will be looking at the actual Cuban Missile Crisis and how the world was so close to disaster. But for now, see you soon. Bye.